All right, what were the provisions of the Concordat of 1801? Clearly very important. Formal reconciliation between the church and the French state. They recognize his government. And when we say recognize, we're not like, hey, you see him at 7-Eleven. Hey, I haven't seen you in a while. What are you doing? It means they formally said, we understand and we recognize that this is the legitimate government of France. It's a pretty big deal. And he turned around and said, we recognize Catholicism as the national religion of France. The church was free inside the French borders to organize worship. Now, here is the one thing which had to have still ticked off the Pope. The church was subordinate to the state, and it had some influence over primary education. If you remember way back at the beginning at the Estates General, the Catholic Church wanted control over all the education in France, all the schools, and that kind of makes sense if you think about it. Whether they're doing it for economic reasons, raising people to make sure they give money to the church, or for religious reasons, making sure that these people grow up to be good Catholics. They had what you call a vested interest in primary education. Primary means elementary grades. So they had some influence. The state appointed the bishops and paid the clergy. Now, again, if France picks who gets to be bishop, that means Napoleon can put his friends in charge. And so if the state is picking the bishops instead of the church, and they are paying the clergy instead of the church, that means most of the clergy's allegiance is going to be to the state and not necessarily the church. So this was probably a bitter pill for the Pope to have to swallow. But he, I guess wanted back in good with France, so he was willing to sign a deal agreeing to all this. Clergy had to take an oath to the state. They'd been doing that before, and the church had objected to it, but I guess at this point they decided, if you can't beat them, join them. Now, here's another important thing. All that property that was taken away was not given back. So they were not given any of their land back. Now, clearly they had some land, or maybe they bought new land for their churches and monasteries, but they never got all that back. And other religious groups like the Protestants were tolerated. If you ever take the AP version of European history, you'll learn that most of the Protestants lived in the far north, up next to the Netherlands, and there was quite a bit of military trouble between the Catholics and the Protestants. So again, this is something that the Catholic Church would not be happy about, but I guess they thought that having some control was better than having no control. And now here's one good thing the church got. Their priests could get up and preach without penalty. Now, I don't know if they were allowed to criticize Napoleon. I imagine because he was paying their salary and appointing them their bishops, they wouldn't do that. But this does give them some freedom of speech during the Mass. And so this is some kind of, I guess I should explain it, but I don't really understand it either, so we're going to skip over this. This has something to do with this Concordat. All right, Code Napoleon. Now, this is every bit as important as the Concordat. This is the Napoleonic Law Code. A little bit of contextualization here. The most famous law code in history is the Code of Hammurabi from the ancient Babylonians. And then during the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire, there was the Justinian Code. So the third most famous code probably in history is Code Napoleon, or otherwise known as the Napoleonic Code. So you're going to need to know a lot about this, okay? All right, so the laws that they had in place before under the feudal system, the medieval system, were confusing, and some groups had different laws. So what Napoleon is going to do, he's going to straighten things out. Remember, at heart, he's a military commander, but he's also a gifted administrator. Some of you that are very organized, remember, my degree is in accounting, and it's kind of a joke now because most accountants, I joke a lot. I say most accountants are short, balding, and fat with glasses, and I don't look like that. Well, I do look like that, except I'm not short. And the thing is that accountants are normally very organized, structured people, and I am anything but. So I got my 4-year degree, and I really should have majored in something different. But anyway, those of you who are very structured and organized, you might want to go into a job where you do like accounting or something like that, because there certainly is a place for people who are organized and structured. Napoleon is all of that. So he's going to come in and he's going to bring some structure to these laws. Napoleon would later say that this Napoleonic Code was his greatest achievement. You would have thought it was all those battles that he won, becoming the military commander that everybody studies. Most of it is still used today. So, like I said, whereas most of Lenin's achievements have been overshadowed by history and discarded, statues have been torn down, Napoleon is still probably the greatest leader, maybe behind Louis the 14th in French history. And he's an excellent compromise between liberalism and conservatism. He's both. So now in AP, they did this one year. They asked a question about Bismarck. They said, was he liberal or conservative? You could absolutely get an essay like this, a paper 2B, and what they do is they give you a statement. They'll say, Napoleon was more liberal than conservative. Construct an argument, agreeing or disagreeing with the statement. So he's liberal in that he kept the gains of the revolution. He believes in a meritocracy. He believes anyone can succeed to the top, but he's also a conservative. Why is he conservative? Well, he cut a deal with the church. He probably is not religious himself, but he cuts a deal because he wants the people to be happy and he wants them to respect his rule. It's not probably about religion. It's about them respecting his rule. And of course, he distrusts democracy. So this would be an excellent essay for them to give you this year. He's both. And you could construct an argument saying he's mostly liberal or mostly conservative. I would write mine if I was given the choice that he was mostly conservative, but he is clearly both. All right, moving on. Now, very important. What did it do? Well, so we're going to talk about what did it do? Was it popular? What was its effect? You need to know all those different facets of the Napoleonic Code. Here's what it stood for. It made everybody equal before the law. I kind of doubt that applied to women. As a matter of fact, I'm sure it didn't. I'm sure it's talking about men. But at least amongst men, there was equality before the law. Freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. That's mean you do what your conscience dictates. Again, a lot of people have no conscience at all. So I'm not sure that in practice does it actually work this way. But that is what the Napoleonic Code aspired to. That's what it wanted to be, not necessarily what it was. The end of feudalism, and that's the Middle Ages. Remember that came after the collapse of the Roman Empire. The rule of law with a right to a proper trial and defense. Now, remember, the Americans set up a bunch of this stuff before this, and Napoleon absolutely knew what the Americans had done. He's a student of the law, and so the American Revolution came first. And just to throw a little bit contextualization into in the 1600s, the English had a civil war, and they had executed their king, Charles I. And so the thing is, they came up with a bunch of rules, a bunch of laws, something like a Bill of Rights. There was an English Bill of Rights that the Americans actually copied in the American Revolution. They just don't call it the English Revolution. They call it the English Civil War. And so the English passed some laws on over to the Americans, and the French are kind of copying some of what the Americans did, although I'm sure Napoleon would say he didn't need to copy the Americans. Freedom to choose one's own profession, a new penal code, rules about what you get executed for, what you get sent to prison for. It covered divorce, marriage, adoption, debts, loans, and gambling. This would be an excellent essay question to give you. And remember, you probably don't need to remember all of this stuff. You need to just remember, if you're doing a paper 2A, you probably just need to remember 3 major things. It would be great if you could take 2 or 3 of these things and group them. That way you could have, 3 topic sentences with, basically groupings, and then inside the groupings, your facts would be each of these things. All right, what are the criticisms of the law code? That's what it did. Here's the criticisms. Favored the middle class. Now, clearly that is his goal, okay? He wants to favor the middle class. He's going to put them first. I've already talked about that. Bias toward the owners of landed property, and he neglected the interest of industrial wealth. In other words, he probably had a clear bias towards landholders in the countryside. And he probably did not pay as much attention to industrial wealth. And I went over when I did my lecture on Napoleon's military, he really disrespected the English, right? Now remember, the next unit coming up is the Industrial Revolution in England. He called England a nation of shopkeepers. In other words, hey, it's a bunch of people just trying to make money. As Americans, you probably have no problem. You probably wonder why he'd criticize them. Because if you're typical Americans, you want to make as much money as possible. I assume that's why you're sitting in an AICE class and not taking a regular or an honors class. You want to get college credit because you're motivated. But he said this with disdain. So he probably has a bias against factory owners, even if he doesn't know that he does. Again, he promoted the interests of the state over the individual. This should make perfect sense, because who's he trying to keep in power? Himself. He made himself consul for life. He dressed himself, at least in that famous portrait, in the trappings and attire of a Roman emperor. So clearly he's going to value his right to be emperor over individual rights. He gave too much authority to the father over the family and the husband over women. As a matter of fact, the women in the French Revolution never got equality. They never did. But under the National Assembly, they had gotten more rights than they'd ever had before. And kind of when they pushed the Catholic Church out, they kind of gained some more rights there. Well, he's going to bring the Catholic Church back, and he's going to reestablish men as the authorities in their households. So it's kind of a step backward for, women's rights. Offered little to the landless. So again, remember in the United States, to vote, when this country started, you had to be free, white, 21, and own land. So if you didn't own land there, he didn't give you much encouragement that he was going to look after you. He favored the employer over the workers, and he banned, now this is an important deal, he banned trade unions, and you're supposed to know what they are from our study of them in Unit 2, the Industrial Revolution. That's where the workers band together and sometimes go on strike. He also banned workers' associations. So he may not really favor industrial wealth, but he certainly favors the owners of the factories over their workers. Anyway, I just threw this in for the heck of it. Financial and economic reform, banking and taxation. Here's the boring stuff. The Bank of France was forced to bring order and stability to the banking system and the currency. And remember, my other class that I teach and have taught for 11 years is AP Macroeconomics. And I tell the kids in that class they're lucky because a big chunk of learning economics is learning about banking. And my first job out of college was working in a bank. So again, you probably have not put much thought into it. I certainly hadn't when I was 15 years old. But if you do not have a stable banking system and currency, your country is going to be in for a world of hurt. He ended forced loans and cycles of inflation and deflation. Inflation is prices going up. Deflation is prices going down. And prices going down probably sounds like a good thing. They are both pretty much equally destructive. What you really want is the price level to be stable. The Federal Reserve is in charge of maintaining price stability in the United States. That means keep prices from going up or down. They're both equally destructive, although it may not seem that way right now. Let me see what I want to add on this. I kind of am very skeptical that he actually achieved this, because nobody's been able to achieve this through history, really. The socialists tried probably harder than anybody, and look where those people are, nowhere. So anyway, if you want to write this in your notes, this is referred to in business classes as the business cycle. The business cycle goes up and down and up. The economy improves and it goes down. That's not really inflation and deflation, but it's similar. It's this natural rhythm of life that goes on. And I'm very skeptical that Napoleon actually managed to stop this, but it was apparently one of his goals. He made sure that the state's debts, now that would be France's debts. If France owed somebody money, he made sure they paid them on time. This is major, because a lot of countries, you loan them money and they never pay it back. He balanced the state budget with expenditures matching revenue. Again, I know this is boring stuff, but to somebody with a degree in accounting, this is music to my ears. What that means is, let's say he got $100 million in taxes. They spent $100 million that year. Right? They didn't take $100 million in taxes and spend 150 million like our government does, except our government goes in the hole to the magnitude of trillions every year. I think we're on average now spending $4 trillion more than we bring in. But I digress. This is it's boring stuff, but it's pretty advanced stuff. The new reward for service to the estate, and I have estate there, but I suspect I did this in a hurry, the word estate. He came up with a new medal called the Legion of Honor. He strictly controlled the price of bread. You want to asterisk this. Now, a lot of economists would tell you, and I would tell you, that is a mistake. But after all the bread riots they had in France, and you know what's going to happen in Russia, he just made sure that they kept the price of bread cheap because he did not want any revolutions on his watch. I'm sure in the long run he did care about the French citizens, but he also wants absolutely no challenges to his authority. So keep the people happy. The quality of roads improved. There was improving communication, trade, again, sorry for the typo. And so once you have better roads and better communication, trade is going to improve. You can also use those roads to move troops. That is a pretty advanced concept. The Persians years ago built a road called the Persian Royal Road to move their military around. The Inca in South America built roads. I've seen pictures of them. They're really like hiking paths because there were no horses over here. They had llamas. But the Native American Incas had roads to move their military. The Romans had roads. They're the most famous roads in history, the Roman roads. And the Nazis built roads to move their military in the 30s, that, Hitler did. And the Americans copied the Germans, and we built the interstate highway system. And in the 1950s, under President Eisenhower, a former general. And one of the reasons for that was we could use our military, or at least we could evacuate our cities during a nuclear threat. So this is pretty advanced. So he's building roads and he's improving communication. That's to boost trade, but that's also going to boost his communication with his military and his ability to move them around. Now, I believe this is the last topic. Remember, the Catholic Church really wanted to control education. Here was Napoleon's education policy. Catholic Church had been in charge of it, or at least most of it, and they were primarily interested in the primary grades, what we would call elementary school. The Concordat, oh my gosh, there's that typo again. Concordat of 1801 had restored that for primary education all the way up to age 10. But Napoleon was interested in educating boys ages 10 to 16. Now, this should be very, very obvious why he's doing this. I'm sure he wanted them to serve the state and government, but he clearly, almost assuredly, wanted them for military service. Because remember, he is first and foremost a general, a very talented general who went to a military academy in France, probably was made fun of by the other French students because his heavy Corsican accent. So he wants to absolutely make sure that boys in their teen years are heavily educated. Curriculum is controlled by the state. The teachers trained, paid, and monitored by the central government. That means out of Paris, not out of the provincial areas. You may hear that the United States, we've had multiple presidents promise to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. And the current president is apparently trying to actually do that. Don't know how that's going to work out, if that's going to be allowed. But a lot of what is done in Florida, and a lot of the things you are forced to learn, are mandated by the state of Florida. So we talked about that in class today. The most important government in your life right now is not the U.S. government. As long as we don't have economic problems or a war, the most important factor in your life as far as the government goes is the state government, what the governor does and the state board of education. Anyway, but in France, everything was dictated by the central government in Paris. Little focus on religion, mainly French and math to create a middle-class elite. I don't know why that says non-revolutionary, to administer France in the future. I think what I meant there, what I put non-revolutionary, is what I said earlier in either this lecture or the last. You're going to school. Clearly what we're trying to do, we're trying to prepare you for life. We're trying to help you get into a good college. But I am not at all shy I am an extremely proud American. I don't know why I wouldn't be. And I want you to buy into the system. I want you to go to a good college, get a good education, have a happy home life, and pay taxes and support the system. Right? You know, I will be, when I retire here, which could happen at any moment or a couple of years, it's in my best interest to have the people, the younger people running the country, doing a good job so I'm comfortable in the old folks home. All right, he set up this thing, the AICE system now. I want you to underline that. Pretty big deal in AP European history. And that is for advanced and specialist education for future leaders. I don't know if it qualifies as an academy or a college system, but that's kind of an advanced system. And so he clearly has his focus on education. And in 1808, they created a university system in France. He felt educating, and that should be educating out education. He felt educating the poor and women was a waste of time and money. And that is the end of my lecture on Unit 1 in AICE European History. My email address will be in the description. And if you're watching from another school, I would appreciate an email. I'm just very interested to see if anybody else is watching that does not go to Apopka High School. Anyway, I've got all sorts of error things here triggered on my screen. Let me figure out how to, you can go ahead and switch off while I figure out how to fix this situation here.